All right, so today we are covering the Russian Revolution, which is going to take place during World War I, in the latter part of the 19 teens, as a communist revolution breaks out against the czars of Russia and their absolute monarchy. So Tsarist Russia, which is Russia that has a king, enters World War I with an absolute monarchy. There are very clear class divisions between the elite in the top and the peasants. So what this chart actually is going to show you is that they still have the serfs that we talk about with feudalism during, that's something that you talked about during World History 1 class, right, where you had lords and nobles and, knights and dukes, and then you had all the peasants doing all the work. There's still that split, even though this is literally the 20th century, this is the 1900s. Russia is missing out on the Industrial Revolution that the rest of the world has, and is experiencing this very slow growth, where these people at the top here are the ones controlling everything. And you can see, much like the French Revolution of the 1700s, that the peasant class is much larger, but is actually bearing the brunt of everything that's going on. So the grievances, the problems that the workers and the peasants were complaining about are not solved by Tsar Nicholas. Tsar Nicholas is not particularly great at solving problems. He's very ineffective as a ruler. This is Tsar Nicholas here with his wife and his children, all of whom are going to be dead by the end of the Russian Revolution. But he actually doesn't really know what to do. He's very incompetent. He doesn't really know what to do with the concerns that the Russians have. And he can't really solve any of their problems. So he's actually really ineffective as a king. And that inadequate government that he created during World War I leads to a revolution and a provisional government, a temporary government, in which they actually instituted a democracy, a democratic system, mirrored after what was happening in the rest of Europe. But there's a second revolution that happens in November called the, confusingly enough, the October Revolution, that's led by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are a communist group that's going to come into power in Europe, led by Vladimir Lenin, that is ultimately going to take over this democratic system from the leaders of the provisional government and turn Russia into the Soviet Union that we know for the rest, essentially, of the 20th century. So the causes of the Russian Revolution, sorry about that, there are 4 of them. The first is the embarrassingly terrible loss in 1905 of the Russo-Japanese War. So Russia fights against the Japanese. And, not to their, discredit, Japan is a very powerful, very successful military country. But they were fighting over something called Manchuria. So this section here of now China, between Russia and Japan, and the Japanese attack, and Russia was trying to create essentially this barrier zone of basically what is now North Korea. And embarrassingly enough, they lost not only this neutral area, which gave them a warm water port into the Pacific Ocean, but they also lost Manchuria itself, which is just, there's a lot of loss of life, and people don't have as much confidence in their government when you're a big, powerful European country and you're losing to Japan. You also have the peasants, the poor people of Russia, right, who don't have any rights, they don't have any land, they don't even have the right to own land, and so they are basically just, starving in the, all over Russia, to be perfectly honest. Tsar Nicholas, the king, Tsar Nicholas Romanov, is just really terrible at his job. But one of the other, weird and sort of crazy things that Tsar Nicholas does is he and his wife take over, take under advisement, the the advice of this creepy gentleman here, Gregorio Rasputin. Tsar Nicholas, this is obviously a political cartoon, but Tsar Nicholas and his wife have a son who ultimately should be the next Tsar, right? The next king, Alexei. And he is a hemophiliac, right? So he has a genetic disorder, which means that he is very sick because, like, literally just, like, knocking him over could technically kill him because it could cause internal bleeding because his blood doesn't clot. And Rasputin is basically like a shaman. He's a medicine man. He's a creepy, creepy individual. And he claims that he can cure their son of hemophilia, which, by the way, you can't. It's genetic. But he is very creepy. Like, that picture, that drawing, while it is a political cartoon, fairly accurate to what this man looked like. But people were very creeped out by this. And they said that he had undue influence over the Tsar and his wife, which was not great for your public image. And then when you're, like, not doing anything to help the starving people of your country, but yet you're listening to this creepy guy, doesn't bode well for people, like, liking and supporting you. And then also in World War I, the Russians aren't doing very well. They're losing a lot to the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, including massive casualties. In the notes on the results of World War I actually have a chart that shows that the Russians, despite the fact they don't fight all of World War I, suffer the most losses of all the Allied powers. It's a very, very deadly war. And any time that you are losing men like that, losing these people are losing their sons, their brothers, their husbands, it's gonna lead to a lot of discontent and a lot of distrust in the government itself. So, there's only a couple of key things you need for the Russian Revolution. Number one, you need to know that there is a civil war between the Bolsheviks and the provisional government. So let me back up just a second. The Romanovs are taken over, they're taken under house arrest, and ultimately they are executed in their palace. Because you basically have to, in any monarchical system, if you don't kill the monarchy, then later they could come up and say that, say that they are the rightful leaders of the government because their family has had that control. So they execute. Remember from that first slide we had the picture of Tsar Nicholas and his wife and his kids. Yeah, all of them are shot, including their family dog. So no one survives. And that happens early in 1918. But then there is a provisional government put into place with the democracy. There's a war between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, and the provisional government, or the Whites, which ultimately the Bolsheviks win. They are led by a man named Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin is actually going to, within the vein of communism, which is that everyone should be equal, and everything is shared, and the government controls everything and doles out money and food and supplies and stuff evenly, he actually comes up with something called the New Economic Policy, because he recognizes that doesn't work, right? So, according to the New Economic Policy, according to communism, a farmer grows 10 tons of a crop. The government takes everything that you don't need and leaves you with 1, right? Well, according to the New Economic Policy, you grow that 10, but the government only would take half, which means that peasants were actually given some autonomy because peasants were given some means of selling things for a profit, which is going to help boost their economy. So that's what he changes. He promises something called peace, land, and bread. Peace, land, and bread. Where he was going to get them out of World War I. He's going to make sure everybody gets fed, and then he's going to make a system in place where people could feasibly, like the peasants, feasibly could buy farms and create own land. The person that comes after Vladimir Lenin is Joseph Stalin. So Stalin is the dictator that you will need to know for World War II that comes to power in the 1930s. And that's it for the Russian Revolution. Let me know if you have any questions.